3 winters. That is how long she wore the memory of him, the way one wears a scar after a wound has closed. Not visible perhaps to those who did not look closely, but present in every movement, in the precise angle she carried herself, in the deliberate quietness she had built around her life like a wall that was also, in some lights, a home. He was gone. She had become something else, and now the coach was rolling back down the Doverstone road, and the man who had not come to their wedding was coming home. The question is not whether she has forgiven him. The question is this: after 3 years of learning to live without him, of learning to want smaller and safer things, of learning to call that living, does she have anything left that is worth giving? And does he deserve to receive it? If you are listening tonight, tell me where you are, the city, the hour, whether the night outside your window is cold, or whether something warmer has found its way to you. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. This is a story of a woman who rebuilt herself from the ruins of a single January morning, and a man who returned from war not quite whole, carrying a truth he should have given her 3 years before. It is a story of what we choose to believe when fear is louder than love, and what we must confess when fear is finally thoroughly exhausted. It unfolds in the snow, in the silence of Regency drawing rooms, in the cold of a December garden, in the space between 2 people who once chose each other and must now decide, deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost, whether to choose again. Cordelia Whitmore had made her uneasy peace with the cold, not the winter cold specifically, though Doverstone was particularly unforgiving in December, its stone walls sealing in the damp and its chimneys working overtime against a wind that came off the hills with nothing civil about it. She meant the other cold, the kind that settles in one's chest after a certain kind of morning and never entirely lifts, not painfully after the first year or so, but as a permanent quality of the interior weather, a baseline one learns to dress for. She had been 21 when she stood in the church nave in ivory silk. She was 24 now, and she taught piano to the daughters of 3 local families on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she was considered quite accomplished by those who had reason to assess such things. Her violet eyes had a deep steadiness in them that people sometimes mistook for contentment. It was not contentment, it was discipline. There is a difference, and Cordelia knew it better than most. The morning the letter arrived from Fairchild Manor was not in itself unusual. She was at the piano in the parlour of Whitmore House, working through a Clementi sonatina she would teach to Miss Bertram on Thursday. The Bertram girls were improving, both of them, though at different rates. The elder methodical and reliable, the younger more musical, but prone to impatience with the left hand. Cordelia had been thinking about how to address this without diminishing either of them. It was the kind of problem she enjoyed. Concrete, manageable, answerable through careful observation. Her mother appeared in the doorway. Cordelia knew from the angle of her mother's shoulders before the woman had spoken a word. "He is home," her mother said. She held the letter as though it weighed considerably more than paper should. "He arrived last Thursday." The fire popped once in the grate, a sharp sound in the quiet room. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, each flake deliberate, unhurried, committed to its descent. "I see," said Cordelia. "Lady Kincaid has sent invitation. Her winter supper Friday next. She says—" Her mother paused, consulting the letter, as though the sentences there required translation. "She says the party will be small, family and close neighbours. And the Duke of Fairchild is family to Lady Kincaid. His aunt, yes." Cordelia's hands were folded in her lap. She was aware of them there, aware of the deliberateness of their stillness, the way she was managing the space they occupied with a precision that was, she understood, slightly too much effort for something as simple as folding one's hands. "Then we shall go," she said. "It would be impolite to decline. Lady Kincaid has always been kind to us." Her mother looked at her for a moment too long. Mrs. Whitmore was a woman who had spent 3 years watching her elder daughter very carefully, looking for the signs of something she might help carry. She had never found them, because Cordelia did not display the signs. This was simultaneously admirable and heartbreaking, and Cordelia was aware of this and was sorry for it, and did not know how to be otherwise. "I shall write to accept," her mother said. "Thank you, Mama." The snow continued to fall in its patient, indifferent way. Cordelia returned to the Clementi. Cordelia's Tuesdays followed a set rhythm. She rose at 7:30, dressed without assistance because they had only one maid, and she did not like to require things of people before 8 o'clock in the morning. She breakfasted on bread and strong tea at the kitchen table, if her mother was still sleeping, or in the dining room if she was not. She walked the half-mile to Marchfield House by 9 o'clock, the same route every time, down the Whitmore Lane, left at the churchyard, across the stone bridge where the Doverstone Brook made its reliable winter sound beneath ice. She taught the elder Miss Bertram from 9 to 11, then the younger from 11 to 12:30. She walked home. She ate luncheon with her mother, who was a companionable woman and made the meal pleasant. She spent the afternoon on correspondence or household management or reading, depending on what the day required. On Thursdays, she added 2 more students. On Saturdays, she sometimes accompanied her mother to the lending library in the village, where they selected their novels with a seriousness that other patrons occasionally found amusing. By all accounts, it was a useful life. She had arranged it to be useful, because usefulness filled the hours that emptiness would otherwise occupy, and she had found, over the course of 3 years, that a filled hour was considerably easier to manage than an empty one. Mr. Gideon Hartwell had been calling at Whitmore House with increasing regularity since September. He was the younger son of a respectable Shropshire family and had recently taken the tenancy of Harrow Farm on the edge of the Doverstone estate. Good land, well watered, with a farmhouse that had been neglected under the previous tenant and that he was steadily, intelligently restoring. His fair hair, often wind-tousled, and broad shoulders spoke of a life spent outdoors, giving him a directness Cordelia associated with people humbled by weather and the better for it. He was in love with her. She knew this. He had not said so in explicit terms. He was too careful for that, and she suspected he understood that she would need to come to him rather than the reverse. But he had said it in every other way available to a gentleman. In the particular attention he paid to her opinions even when they diverged from his own, in the apple tart he had brought last month, when her mother mentioned in company that it was Cordelia's favourite, in the way he stood when she entered a room as though he had been waiting for exactly that. She liked him. She respected him the way you respect a well-made thing, a piece of furniture that is exactly what it claims to be, without pretension, without hidden flaw. She thought, with honest deliberateness, that he was precisely the sort of man she would have been glad to meet at 19, before she had believed herself promised to someone else. He came on the Tuesday afternoon the snow began, as he sometimes did. He sat in the parlour, his presence a quiet warmth, and drank his tea. He spoke of a drainage problem on the North Field, one he had been working to solve for the better part of the autumn. He had, she had learned, a way of talking about practical problems that was not boring. He noticed the world around him with a kind of respect, the way a careful observer notices things, the texture of mud under frost, the particular sound a drainage channel makes when it clears. He described them with the pleasure of someone who finds the physical world genuinely interesting, and she found herself listening and occasionally asking questions and meaning them. "You seem not quite yourself today," he said, setting down his cup. Not accusatory, simply attentive. "Lady Kincaid's supper is Friday," she said, which was not precisely an answer, but was, she hoped, sufficient. He was quiet for a moment. He knew the history. Everyone in Doverstone knew the history, had known it for 3 years, had formed their opinions, and returned to their own lives as communities inevitably do. What distinguished Hartwell was that he had never offered her his pity or his opinion on the subject, not once in 5 months of close acquaintance. "Shall you go?" he said. "Yes, if it would be useful," he said carefully, "to have a familiar face in the room. I believe Lady Kincaid would be willing to include me in the party." Cordelia looked at him. He was looking at her with that careful steadiness, the quality she valued most in him, that complete absence of demand, the willingness to be whatever the situation required without requiring recognition for it. "I shall be fine," she said, "but I thank you for it." He nodded. He did not press. He was never a man who pressed. After he left, she stood at the parlour window and watched his horse move up the lane between the bare hedges until the gathering dusk absorbed it. The snow was still falling, softly, without urgency. The churchyard wall across the lane was white-edged now. the old gravestones wearing their caps of new snow with the particular dignity of things that have been standing a very long time. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass of the window pane, held them there until the chill moved up through her palm and into her wrist, a small, sharp discipline, a reminder of temperature, of reality. She was fine. She would be fine. She had been fine for 3 years, and there was absolutely no reason why a supper at Lady Kincaid's house should constitute any sort of occasion at all. She went to lay the table for supper, because it was 4:30 and Denman would need the help. Sebastian Fairchild, 4th Duke of Fairchild, had returned to Doverstone not because he wanted to, but because there was nowhere else left to go. This was not self-pity. He was 28 years old and had spent 3 years learning with great difficulty to be precise about the difference between self-pity and honest reckoning, and he was fairly confident he knew which side of the line this was. He had been abroad. He had served in a diplomatic capacity in Portugal and later in Paris after the fall of the city, when the streets were full of exhausted men trying to assemble the ruins of an empire into something that might function as peace. The work had suited him in the way that difficult, impersonal things sometimes suit a person who is privately managing something more personal that they cannot look at directly. He had been good at it. His languages were serviceable, his patience considerable. His ability to sit in a room with men he disliked and identify the precise point at which they might be useful was, he had been told, exceptional. He had returned in October with a slight stiffness in his right knee from an injury sustained in a skirmish outside of Porto that he did not discuss, and a quality of quietness that his valet Pemberton had noted with careful concern. The quietness was not depression, precisely. It was more like the absence of a particular kind of noise, the self-regarding noise that Sebastian understood. Looking back, he had produced most of his life and had not noticed until it had stopped. Fairchild Manor sat on its hill above the village, like a man who has been waiting a long time and has settled into the patience of it. The house was well kept. His steward Denholm was careful and the staff reliable, but it carried the particular feeling of a house maintained in someone's absence rather than truly lived in. This was a distinction Cordelia would have understood, and one Sebastian, walking through the quiet rooms on his first evening home, understood for the first time. He rode out on his second morning. The knee was better with movement than with stillness, and he had always thought more clearly on horseback, the rhythm of it, the particular way the ground came up through the horse's back into his own body, the requirement of small constant adjustments that occupied the part of the mind that otherwise cluttered itself with things it could not immediately address. He took the low road along the valley, which passed through the water meadows where the frost had crystallized the grasses into something that caught the weak December light with an almost absurd beauty. He had not seen English frost in 3 winters. He had forgotten the particular quality of it, the way it made the ordinary landscape look as though it had been taken seriously. He came up through the village at 10:30. He saw her from 50 yards. She was coming out of the lending library with a volume under one arm, pulling on her gloves as she walked. She wore a dark wool coat, practical, well cut, nothing elaborate, and she moved through the village street with the unhurried directness of a woman who has somewhere specific to be and requires no assistance in getting there. He knew her by her posture before he saw her face. He had known her posture for years, the set of her shoulders, the angle of her chin, the particular quality of her movement that had always suggested someone who had thought carefully about how to occupy space and had arrived at a considered answer. He had not seen her in 3 years, and he knew her from 50 yards in winter grey light, and this fact did him no credit, and he was aware of that. She looked up. Their eyes met for a moment, not long, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, but it felt entirely resolved, like a chord finding its end, or a sentence finishing with the perfect word. She looked away first. She continued down the lane at precisely the same pace, without alteration of step or expression. She did not acknowledge him. She turned at the crossroads and disappeared behind the churchyard wall. He sat on his horse in the middle of the village street and held very still. The cold air smelled of coal smoke and damp stone, with something clean underneath, the sharp particular scent of a frost that had not yet lifted. A cart went past, its wheels crunching on the frozen road. Someone called a greeting from across the street, which he returned without quite registering the words. He rode back to the manor. He ate his luncheon alone in the small dining room. He spent the afternoon reviewing the estate accounts with Denholm, which were in reasonable order, and then he went to the library and sat beside the fire for a long time and tried with limited success to read. He thought about Portugal. He did this when the English landscape became too much, too familiar, too full of the precise texture of things he had mismanaged. In Portugal, there had been the particular mercy of novelty, the smell of the river in the morning, the sound of church bells in a register that was not English, the useful foreignness of everything. He had not been happy there exactly, but he had been adequately distracted, and distraction had been for a period the closest available approximation to peace. He had been in the country when he learned from a letter from his aunt, Lady Kincaid, that Miss Cordelia Whitmore had returned to Whitmore House and was teaching music to the local children, and was well by all accounts. He had read this letter sitting on the low wall outside a farmhouse near Sintra, with the Atlantic light very bright and flat in front of him, and he had felt something complex and physical in his chest that had no name he was prepared to assign it. He had not replied to his aunt's letter for 3 weeks. When he did, he said only that he was glad to hear Miss Whitmore was settled. He had left Cordelia Whitmore in a church 3 years ago because he had received a letter 2 days before their wedding that described in careful and specific detail an intimate correspondence between her and a Mr. Alistair Penrose of Derbyshire. The letter was unsigned. It contained the kinds of details that are difficult to invent: times, locations, the content of certain notes alleged to have passed between them. He had read it at 8 in the morning, sitting at this same desk, and had sat with it for the better part of that day. He had not gone to her. He had not spoken to her father. He had not confronted the person who had sent the letter or made any attempt to verify its contents. He had looked at it, and at his own fear of being made a fool of, at his own terror of having committed himself completely to a person who had not committed herself in return, and he had found that the fear was louder than anything else, and he had let it be. He was not proud of this. He had not been proud of it for a long time. He had dressed it for a while as pride and dignity and the self-respect of a man who refuses to be made an object of amusement. But in Portugal, in the long evenings by the Tagus, with nothing to do but think honestly, he had looked at it without that dressing and found it for what it was: a retreat he had been planning on some level for months, and a piece of paper that had given him the excuse to make it. The fire burned low. He added coal. He did not go to bed until very late. Lady Kincaid's winter supper was the kind of event that was called small in invitation, and revealed itself as rather more extensive once guests arrived. There were 30 people in the dining room, arranged with Lady Kincaid's habitual competence. The colonel, recently returned from the north, placed next to the clergyman from Shrewsbury, the younger women distributed usefully among the older men, the conversational currents managed with the quiet authority of a woman who has been running rooms for 40 years and finds it no more demanding than breathing. Cordelia arrived with her mother at 7:15. She wore her best evening gown, deep blue-green, the silk a little old, but the cut still good, and pearl drops at her ears that had been her grandmother's. She was aware, as she sometimes was when wearing this dress, of looking precisely right for the occasion, and she was aware simultaneously that this awareness was doing its particular work, standing slightly outside herself and assessing the picture she presented, which was a habit she had developed after the church and which she did not on the whole object to. It kept the focus external and the interior manageable. She saw Sebastian immediately. He was across the room speaking with the colonel, his back partly turned toward the door. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply, in 3 years of careful maintenance, allowed herself to flatten the specifics of him into something more abstract and less difficult to carry. The actual physical man was harder to abstract. The width of his shoulders, the way he stood with his weight shifted slightly left, which he had always done, which she had never apparently forgotten. She accepted a glass of wine from a footman and turned to speak to Mrs. Colonel Aldbury about the difficulty of obtaining decent reading candles in December, which was a subject on which Mrs. Aldbury had strong and specific opinions. Supper passed without incident. Lady Kincaid's cook was excellent. The colonel was entertaining. Cordelia sat between the clergyman's wife, a pleasant woman with 3 strong opinions and the intelligence to know when to deploy them, and an elderly baronet who was in the last stages of a complicated story about a disputed inheritance in Herefordshire and appeared to have no need of responses, which suited her. She was aware of Sebastian across the table, much the way one is aware of a fire in a large room, not directly observed, but its presence informing everything about the quality of the air, the way the light fell, the subtle shifting of conversation. Afterward, the party moved to the drawing rooms and split into smaller groups. Cordelia found herself near the window with Lady Kincaid and 2 other women, and was listening to a story about a christening in Yorkshire when she became aware of him standing at the edge of the group. Lady Kincaid smiled with the warmth of a woman who is very fond of her nephew, and has also been waiting with genuine interest to see what would happen when these 2 people encountered each other in her drawing room. "Your Grace, you must know Miss Whitmore. She has been a tremendous comfort to the neighbourhood these past years." "Miss Whitmore and I are acquainted," Sebastian said, his voice. She had allowed herself to forget the quality of it too in the same deliberate way. The quietness it had now was not a quality she remembered. The old version of it had been more assured, not arrogant exactly, but carrying the comfortable confidence of a man who had not yet had reason to question the fundamental validity of his own judgments. What she heard now was something that had been reduced to its essentials, like furniture that has had all its decorative elements removed and revealed itself as structurally sound without them. "Your Grace," said Cordelia. She met his gaze for exactly as long as courtesy required, and then returned her attention to Lady Kincaid, who was asking whether she had heard anything of the Bertrams' elder son, who was rumoured to have taken a commission. She did not look at him again for an hour. She was aware of him moving through the room. She was aware of Miss Prudence Whitmore, her cousin who had extended her visit following the supper invitation, positioned near the punch bowl with a brightness in her manner that was slightly excessive for the occasion. Prudence was 26 and pretty, and had always possessed a quality of performance about her social self that Cordelia had never found troubling before, and that now, for reasons she could not precisely articulate, made the back of her neck feel cold. She noticed that Prudence did not approach Sebastian. This was in itself unusual. Prudence had always been sociable to the point of ambition, and the Duke of Fairchild was precisely the sort of person a woman of Prudence's social inclinations would have sought to greet. Instead, she remained at the far end of the room, her back slightly toward the fireplace where Sebastian stood, her conversation with a young married woman near the window animated to the point of distraction. She did not once, that Cordelia observed, look in his direction. People who are anxious about a particular corner of a room generally avoid looking at it. Cordelia had known this for years, had employed it herself on occasion. She noted it now, without quite knowing what to do with the noting. It was near 9 o'clock when she stepped out into the corridor to retrieve her mother's shawl from the cloakroom. The corridor was narrow, dimly lit by a single wall sconce, and smelled of beeswax and the faint, lingering ghost of old wallpaper. He was there. He was not waiting for her. She believed that looking at the way he stood, the wine glass he was holding, the quality of a man who has stepped away from a party for a moment of quiet rather than to intercept someone. But the corridor was narrow, and there was no way through it that did not pass him. She moved toward the cloakroom. He stepped aside to allow her to pass. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She stopped. She did not turn fully toward him, but she stopped. The laughter from the drawing rooms reached them muffled and irrelevant, belonging to another atmosphere entirely. "Your Grace," she said. A moment of quiet stretched between them, long enough to mean something, too short to demand a quick reply. "I'm glad to see that you are well," he said. His voice was careful with it, not performing sentiment, simply stating a fact he apparently felt required stating. Something in her chest took note of this, the way skin registers a sudden change in temperature, not pain but a precise, undeniable awareness. She said, "Thank you. I hope your return journey was comfortable." She collected the shawl. She went back to the drawing room. She said nothing to her mother about the encounter. It had been objectively a perfectly ordinary exchange between two people who knew each other slightly and had happened to be in the same corridor. There was nothing in it that required reporting. Her hands were quite steady. She was paying attention to that. He found it on a Wednesday afternoon. He had been looking for a document related to the eastern boundary of the estate, a matter of a disputed field that Denholm had flagged in October and that Sebastian had been meaning to address. And he had worked through his father's old bureau methodically, drawer by drawer, finding the usual accumulation of a dead man's life. Letters of credit, receipts, a small leather diary that he set aside without opening. The letter was in the third drawer. Not filed, not deliberately stored, simply placed, the way one places something one cannot bring oneself to either keep or destroy. He recognized it the moment he saw the paper. His own handwriting on the outside, Miss Whitmore's address, written in a version of his hand that was a little less controlled than his present one. He had carried it to her, unopened, the day before. No. He had received it. Of course, he had not written it. Someone had sent it to him. He sat down and read it. 3 years. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, and the ink had the dry, brownish quality of old correspondence. The handwriting inside was compact, careful. Each letter formed with a precision that suggested someone who had thought about how they wrote and had made decisions about it. The lowercase y was particular. The tail curved back upward at the end in a small flourish, as though the writer had learned this letter from someone who made it graceful and had not quite achieved instinctiveness in the imitation. He read it twice. Then he put it on the writing table and went to find the note that Prudence Whitmore had sent last week. A cheerful social note confirming her attendance at Lady Kincaid's supper, brought up with the day's post and retained in the correspondence basket because it had not required a reply. He placed the two documents side by side, the compact handwriting, the careful letters, the lowercase y with its aspirational, flourishing tail. He stood very still. Outside the library windows, the December garden lay bare and white and utterly silent. The clock on the mantel measured out 1 minute, then another, with quiet, steady ticks. A coal shifted in the grate, a small, settling sound. Prudence Whitmore was Cordelia's cousin, the daughter of her mother's elder sister, a frequent presence at Whitmore House in the years of Sebastian's courtship. She had been pretty in those years, and animated, and she had paid him a kind of attention that he had noticed without examining, the particular attention of a woman who watches a man at social gatherings and finds ways to be in the same room as him. He had found it pleasant, without finding it significant. He had not thought of her as a woman in love with him. It had not occurred to him to wonder about it. He sat down. He had believed the letter because he had been afraid. He understood that. But he had also believed it because it had been specific and detailed in the way that truth is specific and detailed, and because it had not read like malice. It had read like reluctant information, the difficult honesty of someone who cared about him and was sorry to have to cause him pain. That quality of reluctance had been deliberate. That specificity had been constructed. He had left Cordelia at the altar based on a document built by a woman who wanted him for herself and had not possessed the imagination to understand the full weight of what she was doing. He sat with this for a long time. The fire burned. The snow outside the window was still and white. He thought about the church, not his experience of it, which had been private and closed, a decision made from behind the door of his own fear, but hers. What it had been to stand there. He had allowed himself in 3 years to think of this infrequently and from a distance, because looking at it directly had always required more honesty than he had been prepared to deploy. He was prepared now. He owed it to her at minimum to be prepared now. He did not know what came next. He knew only that the truth existed outside him in 2 pieces of paper on a writing table, and that he could not continue to hold the weight of what he had done without at least giving her the facts of it. Not as redemption, not as a request for forgiveness, simply because she deserved to know, and he was, finally, more afraid of his own silence than of her response to his honesty. Mr. Hartwell came to Whitmore House on a Thursday morning. He arrived at 10:30 and asked, with the clear-eyed formality of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and has thought about it for some time, to speak with Mrs. Whitmore privately. Cordelia was upstairs changing out of her teaching clothes when she heard the door, and she sat for a moment at her dressing table before going down. She was not surprised. She had known this was coming the way you know winter. It had been approaching for a season. Its arrival only awaited her attention. When her mother came to find her 40 minutes later, Cordelia was in the window seat of her bedroom, with a book open in her lap that she had not read a word of. The light outside was flat and grey, very even, the kind of muted light that winter produces on still days when the cloud cover is total and everything exists in a soft, careful suspension, holding its breath. "He has made his intentions very clear," her mother said. She came and sat in the small chair beside the window, and she held her hands together in her lap, and she looked at Cordelia with the particular expression of a woman who loves her daughter very much and has learned over 3 years not to say the things she most wants to say. "He is a very good man, Cordelia." "Yes," said Cordelia, "he is. He has asked to speak with you himself, whenever you are ready." "I asked him for a little time to think." "Of course." Her mother looked at the window for a moment, then, "Take whatever time you need. He said as much himself." After her mother had gone, Cordelia sat in the window seat and looked at the bare oak at the far end of the garden, its branches exactly black against the grey sky. She listened to the house, the small sounds of it, Denman moving in the kitchen passage, the settling of wood in the parlour grate, her mother's footsteps on the stairs. She put on her thick wool coat and went to the garden, needing the cold air. The snow was still on the ground in the places where the shade had kept the sun from it, blue-white and firm underfoot, the kind of snow that had been there long enough to compact. Her breath came out in slow, visible clouds. She walked the path between the dormant flower beds, the ones her mother planted every spring, with a steadfast faith in the future that Cordelia had always found quietly remarkable. She thought about Gideon Hartwell, with the quiet care and precision he deserved. She catalogued his qualities the way she had been taught to catalogue a piece of music, beginning with its structural elements and moving inward toward the more difficult nuanced assessments. His steadiness, his intelligence, which was practical and observant and did not require display, his humour, dry and warm by turns, and never deployed at the expense of those who could not defend themselves, his genuine goodness, which was not a performance but a character, the kind of goodness that does not require maintenance because it is simply what a person is made of. She liked him. She said this to herself again in the garden in the cold, with more precision than before. She genuinely liked him. She trusted him. She felt easy in his company in a way she had not felt easy with anyone in a long time. She thought, with the particular honesty she reserved for cold garden walks, that in a version of her life that had not included a January church and an empty altar, she might have been happy with Gideon Hartwell. She stood at the end of the garden path, the old oak at her back and the house before her, with its warm, reliable smoke rising from the chimneys. She thought about what she would be giving him if she said yes. She catalogued that too. She would give him her company, which was genuinely pleasant, her capability, which was real and considerable, her respect, which she did not give easily or without reason, her warmth, which was less visible now than it had once been, but had not been entirely extinguished. She would not give him the part of her that was still, 3 years after a January morning, occasionally awake at 3 in the morning with her hands flat on the cold sheets beside her, and an awareness she could not entirely silence. She would not give him a whole heart. She would give him most of one, carefully managed. He deserved a whole heart. He deserved someone who was not managing. She stood at the end of the garden path for a long time. A robin landed on the low stone wall at the garden's boundary, small and round and very red against the white and grey of everything else, with the particular confidence of small birds who have established their territory and see no reason to doubt their ownership of it. It regarded her for a moment, its bright eye making its brief absolute assessment, and then flew away without apparent concern. She thought, the thing about choosing something smaller than what you want is not that it is dishonest exactly. One can be entirely honest about it. One can say, I am choosing this because it is good and real, and because the other thing is gone, or damaged, or unavailable to me. One can mean it. And still, 10 years later, 20 years later, in the very early morning when the rest of the household is asleep, one will know the difference between what one chose and what one might have chosen. One will know the exact shape of the absence. She had not let herself think about this. She thought about it now in the garden, with the robin gone and the oak above her utterly still, and the cold very clean against her skin. She went inside. He sent no note. He simply came. Cordelia was in the parlour on Saturday morning when Denman appeared in the doorway with the card of the Duke of Fairchild and the information that His Grace had called and wished to know if Miss Whitmore would receive him. She sat with this for a moment. The fire in the parlour was the good, steady kind, and the Clementi was open on the piano, and the morning had been, until this moment, unremarkable. "Show him to the drawing-room," she said. "Tell my mother I have a caller. Tell her there is no need for her to come down." The drawing-room was the formal room, the best furniture, the cold hearth, the particular atmosphere of a space that is kept ready for occasions it is not regularly asked to serve. She did not light the fire. She went in as she was, in her morning dress, her hair plain and neat, without adjustment. He was standing at the window. He turned when she entered. He looked like a man who had not slept. There were shadows under his amber eyes that the kind candlelight at Lady Kincaid's supper had mercifully concealed, and the set of his jaw was the one she had always recognized in him as the expression he wore when he was preparing to say something he would rather not be required to say, but had decided to say anyway. She sat in the chair nearest the door. He remained standing. He said, "I will not take a great deal of your time. I have come to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago, and I want to say it before I have the opportunity to reconsider, because you deserve the plain facts of it, regardless of what they cost me to give." The fire in the grate across the hall ticked once, a small, sharp sound. The morning outside the drawing-room window was flat and still, a grey canvas. "3 days before our wedding," he said, "I received a letter. It was unsigned. It described in specific detail a correspondence between you and a Mr. Alistair Penrose of Derbyshire. I read it. I believed it." The silence in the room stretched, heavy and complete. "I did not come to you to ask whether it was true," he continued. He was looking at her steadily, not performing steadiness, but simply delivering each sentence as clearly as he could, without decoration. "I did not speak to your father. I made a decision without—" He stopped, began again. "Without giving you any opportunity to address it. I did not come to the church." He stopped for a moment. "I am telling you this now because I have recently determined that the letter was not sent by an anonymous well-wisher. The handwriting belongs to your cousin, Miss Prudence Whitmore." Something moved through Cordelia's chest. Not surprise, not precisely. It was more like recognition of the kind that does not feel new, but simply locates something that had been sitting in a drawer one had kept deliberately, carefully, closed. She thought, "I had wondered. I had not let myself wonder, and I had wondered anyway." "You believed it," she said. "Yes." "Without asking me?" "Yes." "Because you needed to." He did not answer immediately. He looked at her, and she saw the moment when he decided not to give her the easier version of the answer, the one that would have attributed the decision to wounded pride or shock or anything external. "Yes," he said. "I think that is accurate." "You were afraid?" "Yes." "Of what, precisely?" He was quiet for a moment. She waited. She was very still in the chair with her hands folded in her lap, and she was aware of her own stillness as a kind of permission, a signal that she would wait for the honest answer, and that the polished one would not serve. "Not of you," he said. "Of what it would mean to have committed myself completely to something, and discovered it was a mistake. I had—" He stopped, started again, with the precision of a man who is cutting away everything that is not true. "I had been afraid of that specific thing for a long time. Since my father died, perhaps, or perhaps before. The letter arrived, and I held it up as justification for a retreat I had already, on some level, been preparing. It gave me a reason that I could call something other than fear." A silence followed. "I am not proud of any of this." Cordelia sat. She thought of the church, the January roses she had been carrying, forced in glass, slightly wrong for the season, which she had known when she chose them and had not cared about. The way the silence had grown, minute by minute, from polite uncertainty to something with a different quality. Her father's arm through hers, growing tense. Her sister beside her saying nothing. The moment at noon, when she had understood that he was not late but absent. and had handed her roses to her sister and walked out of the nave herself without assistance into the January cold. She had thought for 3 years that he had simply not loved her enough, that the whole thing had been a miscalculation of feeling, his, not hers, and that the particular shame of it was to have misjudged how deeply she was loved. This had been terrible. It had also been legible. It had given the wound a shape she could work around. What he was telling her now altered the shape. If the love had been there, if the problem had not been absence of feeling but the stark presence of fear, a fear she had not been trusted to help carry, then the wound was a different thing entirely. Not absence, but failure. Not coldness, but a deep, personal cowardice. She did not know yet, sitting in the cold drawing room with her hands in her lap, which of these was harder to bear. She stood. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I do not expect—" "I know," she said. "I know you don't." She walked to the door. At the threshold she stopped. "What do you want from me, Your Grace?" She asked it without inflection, a genuine question directed at the middle distance rather than at him. He said, "Nothing. I owed you the truth. That is the complete extent of what I came to give." She went out. She walked down the corridor to the small sitting room at the back of the house, the one that looked onto the garden, and she sat in the chair by the window and looked at the bare oak and the white ground and did not move for quite some time. She did not go to Prudence immediately. She went upstairs and sat in the window seat of her bedroom with her hands in her lap and the grey December sky outside, filling gradually with the particular luminous quality of late afternoon. She sat there until she understood, with a clarity that felt like something being set down after a long walk, exactly what she was going to do. Then she put on her coat. Prudence was staying with an acquaintance in the village. She had come up for the Kincaid supper and extended her visit, which Cordelia had found unremarkable at the time. The house was a quarter-mile away. Cordelia walked it in 10 minutes. The cold air was clean and very quiet, sharp in her lungs. She could hear her own footsteps on the frozen road, a distinct crunch with every stride. She was shown into the parlour. Prudence came down looking surprised and then not quite surprised, which told its own story, the expression of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and has finally heard it at the door. Cordelia sat down. "I would like you to tell me the truth," she said. Her voice was level, not cold but precise. "Once, plainly, without decorating it, and then we will decide together what happens next." Prudence was pretty and dark-haired, and had always had the quality of a woman who finds her way around difficult things by preference rather than through them. She looked now like a woman who has run out of ways around and is standing directly in front of the thing she has been avoiding, and knows it, and is doing the difficult work of not looking away. "I wrote the letter," she said. The parlour was very quiet. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. I had been... Prudence stopped. She looked at her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap. "I was in love with him since Lady Marley's midsummer party in 14. He never looked at me in that way. And then your engagement was announced, and I—" She stopped again. Her voice, when she continued, was smaller than Cordelia had ever heard it. "I did not think clearly about what I was doing. I told myself that if he truly loved you, he would come to you and ask, and you would clear it up in a moment. I told myself that if he believed it without asking, he did not deserve you." Cordelia sat with this. "And did you believe that?" she said. "That if he believed it, he did not deserve me?" Silence stretched between them. I needed to believe it. The parallel was there in the room between them, and neither of them required it to be named. "I understand," Cordelia said. She meant it, not as forgiveness, not yet, but as recognition. Fear made people do the things they needed to believe were justified. She had learned this more thoroughly in the last several hours than in all her previous 24 years. "You will go to Bath," Cordelia said. "My mother's sister is there. I will write to her this evening and arrange it. You will go before the week is out." "Cordelia, I am not angry with you," she said. And the strange thing was that it was true. She had expected anger, had been bracing for it since she left Whitmore House, and what she found instead was something more settled, something heavier and quieter. I may be angry later. I think it is probable that I will be. But at present I am simply asking you to go." Prudence went. Cordelia walked home in the failing light. The sky to the west was the deep violet of a December dusk, and the snow that remained in the shaded places of the road was blue and still underfoot. Her breath came out in slow, white clouds that disappeared almost before she had finished making them, like fleeting thoughts. She thought about Gideon Hartwell. She thought about him with the care he deserved, honest, specific care. He would make a very good husband to someone. She believed this without qualification. He would be steady and attentive, and he would listen, and his children would be loved, and he would grow into a good old age with a woman who could give him all of herself rather than most of herself carefully managed. She could not be that woman. She saw this now without the ambiguity that had surrounded it a week ago. It was not Sebastian, not entirely, and she did not want to pretend even to herself that it was. It was more fundamental than that. It was the recognition that you cannot build something sound on a foundation you know to be incomplete. She would go to him tomorrow morning. That much was owed. Not a letter, not a note delivered through an intermediary. She would go to him herself and tell him clearly, and be sorry for the pain of it, which was real. Tonight she sat at the small desk in her bedroom and wrote a different letter. To Sebastian Fairchild. Not words of love. She was nowhere near that, and she knew it. Simply this: if you are willing, come to the garden at Whitmore House at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. There is something I would like to say to you. She sealed it. She gave it to Denman to deliver before she could think about it too carefully. Then she went to the piano in the cold parlor and played quietly by memory in the dark. A Scarlatti she had known since she was 15, the kind of piece that lives in the hands rather than the head, a comfort in its familiar turns, until her mother appeared in the doorway and asked gently whether she might consider coming to bed. She went to bed. She lay in the dark with her eyes open, listening to the house settle around her in its reliable, patient way, like an old friend breathing. Outside the window, the sky was very clear and very black, and entirely full of stars, a vast, indifferent canvas. She was frightened. She noticed that and did not especially mind it. Fear, she had learned, was not an instruction. It was simply information. She slept, eventually. Not for long. The morning came clear and very cold. She rose early and dressed with more than her ordinary care, which she noticed and did not pretend was accidental. Not her best dress. That would have been too much, a performance she did not want to put on. The dark blue wool with the velvet collar, practical and warm. The dress that had always made her feel exactly the right size for herself. She went to Hartwell first. She had promised herself that. She walked to Harrow Farm in the thin early morning light, and she told him honestly and directly, and with genuine sorrow for his disappointment, which was real and which she respected, that she could not accept his offer. She did not give him reasons. She told him only that she was not in a position to give him what he deserved, and that she was sorry for it. He received this with the quiet steadiness she had always valued in him. He thanked her for coming in person. He said that he hoped she would be well. He meant it. She walked back to Whitmore House. He was already in the garden when she came through the gate. He was standing at the end of the path under the bare oak, his back to the house, looking at the frost on the grass. He heard the gate and turned. He did not speak. He waited, which was the right thing, and he knew it was the right thing. She walked the path toward him. The frost crunched under her boots in the clean, definitive way of very cold mornings, each step an exact, sharp sound. The winter light was pale and even, very clear. The kind of light that shows everything as it is, without flattery, without mercy. She stopped a few feet from him. "I am not ready to forgive you," she said. She had thought carefully about how to begin and had decided that the first thing needed to be the truest thing. "I want to say that plainly, because I think you deserve plainness from me. I may not be ready for some time. I am not certain what readiness will look like when it arrives." He nodded. He did not speak. "But I understand now," she continued, "the difference between a man who leaves because he does not care and a man who leaves because he is afraid. Those are different wounds. They do not require the same response." She stopped for a moment. The crow that nested in the oak above them moved in the bare branches, settled, went still. What you did was wrong. It was cowardly, and it cost both of us 3 years that I am not certain we can account for. I need you to know that I know that. I am not standing here because I have set any of it aside. I know, he said. His voice was very quiet. Not asking for anything, simply present. I have spoken to Mr. Hartwell this morning. She watched his face when she said it, not to see what she wanted to see, but because she owed herself the honesty of observing rather than imagining. I told him I cannot accept his offer. I want to be clear that this is not a declaration of anything. It is simply that I could not, in honesty, enter into an agreement with a man whose goodness I value, while another man is standing in my garden, telling me the truth about what my last 3 years were built on. Something shifted in his amber eyes. Not relief, something more careful than relief, more aware of its own fragility. The look of a man holding something he knows is not yet his and has not permitted himself to claim. I went to Prudence, Cordelia said. She confessed she is leaving for Bath. Silence settled between them, the cold garden, the clear sky. I am sorry, he said. I know she is your family. She is. I will work out what to do with that eventually. She looked at him steadily. The question I have been sitting with since yesterday is this. Why did you come to me in person? You could have written. You could have sent the information through a solicitor. Why did you come yourself? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She waited. Because, he said, I am finished with the other way, with the distance that keeps me safe and costs someone else everything. I have been practicing it for 15 years, and I have nothing to show for it that I value. He stopped for a moment. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, the way he had looked at her, she remembered, when they had been young, and he had not yet found a reason to be afraid of what that meant. And because if I was going to stand in front of you and give you the truth, I wanted to stand in front of you and give it. Not from behind a letter, not through anyone else. Another brief silence passed, and then, and because I am very tired of being afraid of you. The crow called once from the bare oak above them. Then the quiet returned. Cordelia stood in the cold garden and let this settle in her, the words and the space around them, and what it meant that he had said them here and not in a drawing room, and not to her mother but directly to her in the cold, where there was no furniture and no performance. She extended her hand, not held out for a bow, her palm upward, her fingers open, the gesture of a woman offering something she has decided, with full knowledge of its weight and its risk, and all that it does not yet resolve, to offer. Not an answer, not a promise, an opening, a first door. He looked at her hand. He reached out and took it in both of his. His hands were cold from standing in the garden, and they held hers carefully, not loosely, not tightly, but with the consideration of a man who understands that some things are not held by force, but simply by being present and not letting go. They stood there, the frost on the grass, the bare oak, his amber eyes on her violet ones in the pale December light, clear and quiet and without the particular noise of pretending.